Hello, friends, and welcome to this video about emotional intelligence and the importance of it for ministers. And we are excited about our guest today. Roy Oswald is someone who has thought a lot about emotional intelligence, has written a lot about emotional intelligence, and has been a thought leader in this field. To give you a little bit of background on Roy, he is an ordained Lutheran minister, pastor. He's also the emeritus executive director of the Center for Emotional Intelligence and Human Relation Skills. Roy, you were also a senior consultant for the Alban Institute for some time, and you've written one or two books as we've gone through the years. I'm assuming. I think that's probably an understatement, is it not?
A little, yes.
How many books have you written?
I've got about 18 books.
18 books. So I want to talk a little bit about emotional intelligence, and I'm curious if you can explain for the uninitiated why emotional intelligence is A, what it is, and B, why it matters for a religious leader.
Right, great question. It has to do with our awareness of self and awareness of our relationships and the kind of wisdom we bring to those relationships and the kind of wisdom we bring to ourselves involved in those relationships. The cornerstone of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. And people that are not self-aware are going to have a hard time with emotional intelligence because they don't see themselves objectively in relationship. So emotional intelligence has to do with self-management, and people that are not aware of themselves are going to have a hard time with self-management. Is there a kind of objectivity you can bring about watching yourself in relationship with others, monitoring your emotions, managing those emotions, having objectivity about those emotions. And then the other skill is the skill of empathy, being able to have some sense as to the emotions that are going on with the people that you're relating to. And how to manage those relationships so that those relationships grow in depth and in quality. And it also has to do with our relationship with our organization, with our congregations in this case. So those are the four corners of emotional intelligence: self-awareness, empathy, self-management, and organizational awareness. This subject has come up just recently in the last 20 years. It really has to do with what's more important, your IQ or your EQ. EQ standing for emotional intelligence. Your IQ gets you in the door. I mean, for clergy, this has to do with the academic training that you've got, and the quality of your theology, the quality of biblical understanding. Your EQ has to do with once you're in the door and you got the call to a congregation, where you're going to go in that ministry depends on your EQ. Your capacity to connect in meaningful ways with congregants. People that are not able to develop in-depth relationship with congregants, their ministry is going nowhere. You may be brilliant theologically, you may be a great preacher, but if you can't establish meaningful relationships with people, likely that ministry is not going anyplace. I had an example in my own congregation about 18 months ago. My congregation fired a pastor. He'd come in with good biblical understanding, good theological understanding, but he couldn't connect with the members of our congregation. And I was proud of my congregation that they were able to say to him, "This isn't working. This isn't good for you. It isn't good for us. Let's terminate this relationship." And basically, my motivation for starting the Center for Emotional Intelligence and Human Relations Skills were exactly for people like him. I offered him scholarships to our workshops, and he consistently turned me down. The thing is that the people that need it the most are least aware of their lack of emotional intelligence. So those are the people that need to be encouraged to attend something like this. The center offers week-long workshops. The pandemic has put that on hold for a year. We're getting back to week-long workshops, and in 2022. But we offer intensive workshops, week-long workshops in emotional intelligence. And we offer these around the country. It's open to all denominations. It was this training that impacted me so powerfully as a young pastor that when this training went out of vogue in about the 1970s, I was determined to bring it back. And that's where I got together with some colleagues and we formed the Center for Emotional Intelligence. And this training is now available. It's a very unique training. There's no training like it. People are put into small groups, and there are 2 facilitators for each small group. And these facilitators offer no leadership whatsoever to the group. So people have to fill the vacuum by entering in. And the role of the facilitator is to facilitate the learning. If there's an important interaction that took place, to just say, time out, let's review this. What happened? What was good about this? What was not so good about this? So that's a brief introduction to emotional intelligence. And any other questions you have at this point?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I discovered emotional intelligence during my doctoral work, and it showed so many things to me about why some people seem to more naturally have a capacity to connect with others. And then as I began to explore it, there was such a debate about whether or not you could actually improve your emotional intelligence. And so as I'm listening to you speak and talking about the workshops, clearly you believe that folks can, in fact, improve their emotional intelligence. So can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? How do you go about building emotional intelligence? How do you go about paying attention to those things?
Well, basically, emotional intelligence starts with your family of origin, and either it's got a good emotional intelligence or it doesn't. But that's where we learn how to relate to others. We learn to relate to siblings. We learn to deal with differences of opinion. We learn to deal with conflict. We learn to somehow get together to harmonize as a family. If you weren't raised in a family that had good emotional intelligence, you're going to have to find another community that practices good emotional intelligence and learn from watching others interact with others. So in this way, I'm optimistic about congregations. There can be congregations that have good emotional intelligence, that the people practice good relationships, and they relate well to each other. They relate well to their minister. So possibly in a congregation, you can learn better emotional intelligence. But therapy is another avenue. This has to do with understanding oneself and what makes one tick, and those mysterious sides of self, those things that puzzle us about ourselves, why we feel a certain way is at certain times. And that kind of self-awareness is really important. And self-management is really difficult if you can't have that kind of insight to yourself. So you may be in a conversation with some other people, and you're aware that there's anger rising inside of you, and you've got an inner dialogue that says, can this person handle my anger? And is anger the best way to go in this relationship? And if you think, you conclude that the person can't handle it, then you don't express it. But that has to do with being objective about the feelings that are going on inside of you and being managing those feelings. People that are unaware of those feelings just will naturally get mad. And that then would destroy those relationships possibly. There is a spiritual discipline of meditation, which enhances emotional intelligence. Meditation is another form of self-awareness, where you're sitting quietly and you're just paying attention to yourself and trying to relate to you and God, and relating to watching yourself be quiet and how it is difficult for you to settle your feelings and thoughts. But meditation is another form of self-awareness. So that would be another tool. I think peers can be used in gaining emotional intelligence. This is provided you are motivated to go after feedback. Now, feedback is addressing your blind side, and to be able to ask the question, how did you see me functioning in this meeting? You know, when I said this, what do you see? What did you see happen in the group? So using friends that you trust, asking them for feedback is another way of gaining emotional intelligence. And along with there, I think spiritual direction can also enhance emotional intelligence. So some of the clergy have spiritual directors. I highly recommend spiritual direction with clergy. And we assume that our seminary training train us in spirituality, when in actual fact, they train us academically in biblical and theological sense, but they didn't teach us just some basic ways of relating around those concepts. So that's some ideas about how you can improve your emotional intelligence.
So you mentioned that one of the key pieces of all of this is a self-awareness and being willing and able to admit where you have a blind spot, especially when it continues to undermine your ability to do ministry, or it undermines your relationships just in general. I'm curious if you see other or just some ways in which you've seen clergy have their relationships with their congregations rendered either ineffective or even toxic because they weren't able to sort of take the steps to hear these things about themselves, to become aware of these things. And of course, I won't ask you to name names.
Well, this is usually where some congregations, some clergy need an intervention on the part of their denomination. Clergy that are low in emotional intelligence are going to get themselves into a conflict at some point and not be able to handle it. And somebody's going to have to say, we need to bring in an outside resource person to help us deal with this. Clergy with high emotional intelligence generally don't get themselves into that fix. They're aware of how to deal with difficult relationships. It is my sense that we can increase our emotional intelligence in such a way that we can relate to everybody in our congregation. I mean everybody, not just the ones you like. And clergy with low emotional intelligence, they relate well to people they like, and they don't relate well to people they don't like. Well, with emotional intelligence, you ought to be able to analyze any relationship. And even though you're on opposite ends, politically, theologically, spiritually, you're able to find something that you can have in common, some way of reaching out and connecting. So one of the key theories we use in our workshops is the Johari window. And this is kind of a window of 4 panes. And this has to do with what is known to self and unknown to self, known to others and unknown to others. There's the open window, which is what's known to self and known to others out in the open. There's no hidden agenda. The hidden part of ourselves is where this is known to us but unknown to others. And this is where self-revelation becomes important, and choosing to self-disclose, tell more about yourself, be aware, be open to expressing what's going on inside of you, choosing what it is that you express about your hidden self. This is where I hope there's no meeting in any church that begins without some team building. Mm-hmm. And team building is a way of people connecting on a human basis before we get into the agenda of the meeting. And this has to do with a simple question. Let's go around the circle and share the high and low point of our day. So everybody talks about their day and what was good about it, what was not so good about it. That takes maybe 15 or 20 minutes. We tend to have better quality meetings when you begin with some team building because the trust level is higher. We trust people better, more when we know something more about them. There is what's unknown known to others and unknown to self. This is our blind spot. And people with good emotional intelligence are constantly working on their blind spot. They're asking for feedback. And in a difficult relationship, what is some feedback I could give this person that might help me connect on a deeper level? Where can I ask them for some feedback? And so that's clergy that have good emotional intelligence manage both what they relieve to say, what they reveal about themselves, and what they ask for feedback. The fourth quadrant is a dark area, and this is both unknown to self and unknown to others, and we sometimes stumble upon this by a comment or two, and you say, "Did I really say that, or did you really say that? And what was behind that?" That's where together we can explore the dark. Yeah. So this Johari window is a key theory piece we use in our workshops, but it's a roadmap for clergy to how to deal with everybody in the congregation. And that is the objective, that somehow to make some connection with everybody, whether you like them or not, or whether they like you or not. This is what makes ministry challenging, because there are always going to be people that we're going to have a hard time relating to. And are those people going to be alienated through your entire pastorate, or is there a way in which you can make connections with them as well as the people you like? So that's the complexity of ministry, and the clergy with good emotional intelligence, they're able to manage that well and have competent pastorates.
So if you don't mind, how does that work on the flip side? If you have I'm assuming that an organization or a team can sort of have a collective emotional intelligence, or absence of a collective emotional intelligence. Have you seen instances where a pastor has high emotional intelligence and steps into a system that either seems to have none or has a toxic culture? And can you talk to that just for a moment or two?
That's the challenge of every minister going into a congregation, and I think a pastoral goal is to work on the climate of a congregation. Is this a warm, accepting place? Is this a place that people come into and they immediately look at the interactions between people and the interaction between the pastor and people, and they make the decision, I like this community because I like the way that people interact. I like the kind of positiveness that is here. Clergy coming into a congregation that has a low trust level and the atmosphere is toxic, that becomes then, it's got to be a personal goal to change the climate. And that has to do with starting right at the beginning. Every meeting begins with some team building. We try to bring it into a positive note every meeting. When things in a meeting deteriorate and there are cross transactions, and the minister is able to say, well, hold on a minute, there's something going on here that we need to look at. And so there's time that is taken in the middle of a meeting to look at the quality of relationships and how those toxic relationships interactions become less and less. So meeting by meeting, pastors can slowly change the climate of a congregation. And that can be long-term work. It can be years before you're able to turn a congregation that's toxic into one that's much more caring and where the climate is positive. And your whole evangelism effort of a congregation is going to depend upon you're having a quality of relationships inside the congregation, that when finally people do wander in and are looking for some kind of community, they're going to like the interaction, they're going to like what the climate of the congregation. So that's just ongoing work, and it's hopeful that the clergy that go to those congregations have a high emotional intelligence and are able to pull that off.
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes that's one of the questions we don't even think to ask as clergy are interviewing for positions, or they're deciding, when you interview, you're not only being interviewed, you're interviewing the congregation as well. And sometimes I wonder if we forget to think about the congregational culture, particularly as it relates to emotional intelligence. So that's excellent advice. um, I, I guess maybe my final question, I won't promise that it is, but maybe my final question is something along the lines of, if you could encourage clergy in any particular direction. You mentioned earlier that our education tends to be academic and biblical studies. If you could encourage them to develop one skill or practice or habit uh, to help them with spiritual direction or with emotional intelligence capacity, what practice might you encourage them to look into?
Well, a place to begin would be to be aware of the power of people in any congregation, and they're at the core of any congregation. There are power people, and these may be in the background. They may be silent members, but there's no question they have power and influence on the congregation. To identify those people first, and then to begin to develop a relationship with each one of those individually. The power of a pastor in a congregation has to do with the quality of his or her relationship with the power people. And if you're in a positive relationship with the power people, then you are a powerful pastor. That's a place to begin. Next is to work then with the other members of the congregation and to develop a quality relationship with each one of them individually. Some of this has to do with the size of a congregation, and of course, a small congregation, a family church where it's maybe 30 to 50 people worship on a Sunday. In those congregations, you have to have a positive relationship with everybody, and there are particularly family systems, and there are usually a family system that runs the congregation, or two family systems may be in competition with each other. It's to develop a quality relationship with each of those family systems, and that may take work with individuals within those families, and maybe work with them as a group. Pastoral size congregation where you're worshiping 50 to 100, and the spiritual needs of people are going to be met through the quality of their relationship with their spiritual authority. So it's the quality of what goes on between the pastor and the people. That's where the spiritual growth is going to take place. In a program church, you got more people than you can deal with on a one-to-one basis. So this has to do with relating particularly to the staff of the congregation and to the primary leaders. And in a corporate, a multi-staff congregation, and this has to do with your relationship with your staff members. So a lot of work has to be done on the emotional intelligence that goes on between the senior pastor and the staff. So depending on the size of the congregation determines who you have to go after to build the quality of emotional intelligence in that congregation.
Well, that is excellent insight, and I know that reading your work, Emotional Intelligence for Religious Leaders, was something that helped me really think more fully about these practices within congregational systems, and not just rely on sort of either my own emotional intelligence or my own instincts, but to be thoughtful about how all of these pieces play together. So I'm curious if you would recommend somebody who's just starting out exploring emotional intelligence, is there a text they should pick up? Would it be Emotional Intelligence for Religious Leaders, or would it be the Emotional Intelligence of Jesus? Where would you recommend they begin?
Those books are a start, but basically, I think it's really important to find a coach, and particularly starting out in ministry, and to be in a relationship with a seasoned pastor that is able to kind of reflect with the new pastor, younger pastor, on what's going on, and meeting on a regular basis to just see what's happening, how our relationships unfolding, what's your sense of you're dealing with the difficult people in your congregation. Uh, where are the relationships where you're having a real challenge that you really can't seem to find out why you can't relate in a better way to a certain individual? To have a coach that you meet with regularly would be important. The other is the quality of clergy support groups, and then I highly recommend them. I've got a book out called How to Build a Support Group for Your Ministry. Most clergy groups don't work, mainly because the trust level doesn't develop. And if you got a group of 4 to 6 clergy that are meeting regularly, I highly recommend that they hire a facilitator for the first 6 meetings until the trust level is developed. And then, unless people are trusting the people in that group, they're not going to share their pain and vulnerability. And that to me is the key benefit of being part of a clergy group, the place you can share your pain and confusion, and you're able to talk about what you think is not working well in your congregation. And you've got seasoned pastors, and they're able to bring some objectivity and just help you reflect on how you're relating with your congregation. So find one person that you trust with your pain and confusion. Meet with that person over lunch and ask if you possibly might, between the two of you, develop a clergy support group. If there's an agreement between the two of you, think about 2 or 3 other people that you really would like to be in a relationship with. Call them together and just ask the question, shall we develop a support group here and meet on a regular basis? And if there's an agreement, find yourself a facilitator, someone that manages the relationship until the trust level is high. There are some clergy groups that continually pay for a facilitator throughout their entire life because they feel that that person really does affect the quality of what the conversation. In that clergy support group, you can really explore a lot of the emotional challenges within a congregation and receive some objectivity from your peers. So those are 2 suggestions I would have for someone starting out or for seasoned clergy.
Those are wonderful. The role and the power of a mentor, as well as colleagues along this journey, that we can share with, that we can support and be supported by, is so critical.